morning, and it's wonderful to be back at S4. Last time I was here was a few years ago. I was a little bummed out to see that it was put on the shelf last year, but certainly glad to be back. Glad to see all the faces. So, as was announced, my name is Keith Walsh. I am the Director of OT Security and Operations at Armis. I find myself at Armis after about 18 years in the critical infrastructure space, working with our utilities, working with our DoD, our war fighters, things that roll, float, and fly. And where I find myself at Armis is really, in a space where I have an opportunity on a global scale to work with all sorts of industry verticals. Probably, maybe up to this point, about 12 to 14 of the different CISA verticals I've been directly involved with, understanding what their use cases are, understanding what they're trying to solve for, understanding where they are today and where they want to be tomorrow, and understanding what good looks like. So for the balance of today's presentation, we're going to walk through the framework of what the anatomy of a maritime port infrastructure attack looks like. And it was interesting because this presentation was built probably about 6 months ago. And it was updated over time. It was submitted. It was accepted by S4 and Dale. But the interesting thing, as I was walking through this deck, was that this port could virtually be any piece of critical infrastructure, and as we look to see what occurred in the past week or two, it really plays well in today's geopolitical environment and what we're faced with. When we take a look at Pipe Dream, you could easily take a utility and place it inside this presentation as opposed to the port. You could take a pipeline. You could take a critical manufacturer. You could take an airport, and you could interchange it with this. So as we walk through this, you'll see that there are some really interesting parallels with Pipe Dream. There's some interesting concepts that really span well beyond the confines of a simple port attack. So this is the target. The target was a very large port, and you see the impact that taking down a piece of critical infrastructure would have. Now, this is a South Florida port, but again, this could really be any piece of critical infrastructure. And as we look at the adversaries that we're now faced with, the attack on this particular port, this particular instance, we'll very quickly see that it's not Bitcoin that they're looking for, right? They're looking to create chaos. They're looking to instill fear. They're looking to instill uncertainty, and they're actually looking to harm and to potentially kill American citizens. So this could be really, as we look at the geopolitical forces of today, any NATO nation around the world. So we're going to walk through a sequence of events. As they occurred, we're going to walk through, as Armis was invited to log and to alert on this attack, we're going to be reporting on exactly what had occurred within this particular instance. And it started with a simple drive-by back on October 13th of 2021. It's akin to a thief or a robber driving through a neighborhood, simply looking to do some due diligence, maybe jiggle some locks. And that's what occurred. XPS Black happens to be our adversary, and that's exactly what happened at 8:45 in the morning. It was a Wednesday morning on the 13th. So what did they do? XPS Black then came back the following day, and they ran a DOF attack because they found some wireless networks that were connected within the port. And they found one particular SSID called Port Authority, and they ran a DOF attack against Port Authority. If you're familiar with what a DOF attack is, it's very common. You can Google it. It's a way to do a brute force entry into a wireless network. And that's exactly what they did. And they grabbed .116 as their IP address. So we'll reference and we'll follow through their steps as they begin to navigate and migrate through this network, looking for their end target. And as you see, we're beginning to understand what that movement looks like. And you'll also quite interesting, you'll see that all this is being logged. So XPS Black, when they gain access to the network, they then launch Nmap, which is a common application that you can grab that begins to do network reconnaissance, right? They're looking for targets. They're looking to move north-south and laterally within the network. And what they're specifically looking to do is they're looking for devices that are talking on port 502, port 2222, 44818. We all know what those ports are, Modbus and SIP ports. So we sort of get an understanding of what they're looking for, but we're not quite sure yet. So we're going to watch as they make their next move. Along the way, they also find Raspberry Pis. They find, what else did they find? They find Windows machines, UPS devices, wireless infrastructure, badge swipes, card readers. They eventually settled in on this device called Crane PLC. And Crane PLC responds back with port 23, port 80, and there's our Modbus port, right? Port 502. So this is a bit of an interesting parallel with Pipedream, right? Pipedream and the framework of what Pipedream is, looking at Modbus devices, Schneider devices, Omron devices, talking on port 502, leveraging Modbus. So at this point in time, we understand that our adversary has found a Modbus device. In this case, it's called Crane PLC. But up until this point, we weren't really quite sure what our adversary was looking to accomplish. At this point, we don't know if it was simply a college kid from University of Tampa, if it was advanced persistent threat, if it was a nation-state attack. But when this device eventually connects to Crane PLC on port 502, we start to get a picture of who this adversary is. And this adversary is somebody with skills. This adversary is probably somebody with backing. This adversary is someone that knows why they're there and what they're looking for. And in this particular case, they are looking for a Modbus device talking on port 502, and it's exactly what they've done. So now so at this point, not being sure if they were in it for Bitcoin, not sure if they were in it to create chaos, when we see at 6:59, which is 6 minutes after their first introduction into the network, we find what they're really after, right? Because they start sending coil write commands into that Modbus PLC. So now we know a couple of additional things, right? We know they're not in it for the Bitcoin, at least not initially. Maybe they're going to double back with the threat that it's coming again. But we know that they're looking to instill fear. They're looking to instill chaos. It sort of starts sounding like a nation-state attack. We also know that the Crane PLC is hoisted a 40-foot container up in the air over the port. A moment later, 2 minutes later, the Crane PLC then releases that container into the port, right? So now we know exactly who we're dealing with. We know that they're looking to create chaos, right? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Bitcoin isn't something that they were really after in this particular instance. So we're starting to build the profile of who this adversary might be. And the interesting thing is, up until this point, as you'll notice in red, everything has been logged, right? Every activity, every action that this adversary, XPS Black, has made within the 6 minutes has been logged. Hour later, I guess they stuck around for a little while to see what other damage they could do, maybe watching to see what type of chaos they created. They disconnect from the network, and they're on their merry way. All of it's been logged. So not only has it been logged, but there was a sequence of alerts that were triggered. The first alert that was triggered was the understanding that a new device and an unauthorized device named XPS Black had joined the SSID of Port Authority. That occurred the same moment that that device hit that DOF attack and gained access into the SSID Port Authority. A minute later, we saw this device then launch unauthorized software, Nmap. We saw that device and alerted on that device now port scanning from address .116. So this is XPS Black's address. An alert was triggered because there's an unauthorized device that has launched an unauthorized application suite called Nmap that is now beginning an unauthorized activity, which is a port scan. So it's beginning its reconnaissance. It's looking laterally, it's looking north-south, it's looking for devices that it can connect to. It begins its lateral movement. A couple of MITRE attack alerts were triggered due to that lateral movement, and the command and control that was sent to that Modbus PLC both triggered alerts, and then a moment later was boom, right? So this is when that coil right command hit the PLC, the crane PLC dropped the container, and it hit the floor. So the question is, why did the container drop? If we logged all the activities, if we logged all the actions, if we even alerted, had so much as 5 different alerts that were triggered due to just the sheer presence of this device being on the network and then launching applications, doing port scans, moving laterally through the network, and then command and control activities against that PLC, why did the container drop? And it's an easy answer. Back in October of 2021, Missy invited Armis down to a Hack the Port event down in Tampa, Florida. And what they said was, we want you to sit there passively, and we want you to audit. We want you to basically play back to the audience what exactly occurred during the event. And this was live. You can stream it. If you do a search for Missy, Dreamport, and Tampa 2021, they invited Armis down basically to sit there passively. Now, this is interesting because, I came from the solutions architect side, so I did, a lot of the port infrastructure, working with the port infrastructure organizations through Armis. And my first reaction was, what do you mean you want me to sit there passively? We can kill this connection at the wireless LAN controller. We could kill this connection when it launched Nmap. We could kill this connection when it, started to, launch scans. We could kill this connection when it moved laterally. When those MITRE alerts came up, we could kill that connection. And the response we got was, yeah, well, that would make for a pretty boring simulation, right? So we're like, okay. We will log, we'll alert, we'll audit, we'll basically triage the event that just occurred, and then we'll double back and we'll talk about the best practices on how an environment of critical infrastructure like a port, and again, this could be a utility, this could be a pipeline, it could be critical manufacturing, we'll then double back at the end and we'll talk about the different ways, the best practices to actually prohibit these types of actions from occurring. So there were 2 lessons that we took away from this conversation in Tampa back in 2021. Because after the event, well, actually during the event and after the event, there were dozens and dozens of conversations around what did we learn, because this was a simulation. And this simulation, unfortunately, it's all too real, especially now, with Pipe Dream, which follows along a lot of the same routine, a lot of the same commands that were sent against Modbus devices. It's very topical in today's day and age. So who thought that we'd be where we were today 6 or 8 months ago back in Tampa? So we sat around and we talked about best practices. What does it look like? What do we want to take from this event? What is the messaging that we want to offer up to the audience? And there were 2 unique themes that came from that event. The first one is, how do I stay left of boom, right? Boom is the container dropping into the port. How do I stay to the left of that? It's a CIA term, meaning I want to insert into the kill chain before something goes boom, right? So one of the threads was, how do I stay to the left of that? And what came out of that conversation was, well, I've got all this existing infrastructure. I've got IT infrastructure. I've got OT infrastructure. I've got wireless LAN controllers. I've got firewalls, and I've got NACs, and I've got SIMs and SOARs. I've got managed detection and response. What if we could find a way to leverage that infrastructure to stay left of boom? In this particular example, this is where then I dug my teeth in and I said, you know what, there are plenty of places within that kill chain where we could and where we should insert into that process that really took no more than 10 minutes. The moment that device, XPS Black, connected through that DAuth attack into that wireless LAN controller, that container was on the floor 10 minutes later, right? So what could have happened during that 10 minutes? So you see a diagram here in front of you. There's multiple places that most all entities, all organizations, regardless of CISA vertical that you particularly reside in, there's multiple tools that you already have in place. Number one, wireless LAN controllers. Number two, firewalls, NACs, switches. There's multiple places to insert into that kill chain to stop XPS Black from ever even getting to the point where they can send command and control against that PLC. And you see several of them here, and I've X'd them out. There's multiple places where an organization can leverage its existing tool sets, whether it be Meraki, whether it be Cisco, whether it be Fortinet, whether it be Aruba, whether it be, name your model here. There's multiple places where one can insert and leverage that existing infrastructure as long as it's triggered by something. So we'll come around back to that in a moment, but that's what I wanted to do during this simulation, was I wanted to trigger the existing infrastructure so that we could stay left of boom. And we'll get to how we do that in a moment. But this was lesson number one that we came away with, which was we really need to leverage the existing platform and tools because we already have the people in place that are familiar with those platforms and those tools. So let's integrate and bring a singular solution to the port, in this case, that leverages that infrastructure. Lesson number two, words of wisdom from Sun Tzu. If you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. So we can't necessarily know everything about our adversaries. But what we can do is we can know everything about ourselves, which then puts us back into the first section of that compound statement. If you know yourself, you need not fear the result. And what you see here is a catalog of devices that are oftentimes found in ports. Right? So there's not just PLCs, there's not just controllers, there's not just the SCADA servers, the engineering workstations, the HMI panels, right? Loads of them in a port. But think about all of the other now connected devices that aren't just in ports. They're in utilities, they're in pipelines, they're in airports, they're in the utility grids as you drive up and down the streets, all the traffic cameras, right? The motion sensors. Everything is now connected, and unfortunately, it's unagentable. As you heard Yev and Nadir talk, right? They were talking about this explosion of connected devices that cannot be managed. They're not just found in OT. They're found everywhere. And now with converged networks, Industry 4.0, we've got all of these devices interconnected. So as you look at this diagram, I didn't even circle them all. I probably could have added another 15 devices that are encircled with red squares. And those are devices that are unagentable. So the words of wisdom here is understand that these devices exist within your network, and also they're interconnected within the network. We typically don't scan these devices because, God forbid, we tip one over. We typically don't place agents on IP cameras, on printers, on UPS devices, on PLCs, right? They're unagentable devices. So these are the shadow devices, right, that are unmanageable. There are ways, and we'll get to it in the next slide or so, how we can know ourselves so that we need not fear the result of 100 battles. So that was the second lesson. And interestingly enough, as XPS Black made its way looking for that PLC, remember what XPS Black came across? Came across Raspberry Pis, cameras, printers, UPS devices, right? So those devices were in this simulation, but they're obviously also all around us today. So how do we stay left of boom? How do we know ourselves? How do we know our enemies? So we need not fear the result. So this is conceptually where we want to talk about what is available, right? This is the art of what is possible, right? And the way Armis constructs this messaging and how we've constructed our technology and our solutions in the marketplace is really akin to Google Maps. Now, I use Google Maps all the time. When I'm leaving my house and I'm going to, a vacation, or if I'm leaving my house, I'm going to a new restaurant, I'm popping in that destination because I want to know everything about that destination location. And we all use Google Maps. Some use Waze. Same concept, right? We want to understand where the traffic cameras are, where the police are. We want to understand where the detours are. We might want to understand the context of how long it's going to take if I go this route versus that route, right? That's contextually what Google Maps does for us when we get into the car. But now if we think about what this can do for us contextually when we talk about our enterprise, and in particular, this port, right? So as we plugged into the infrastructure passively into this port just to provide reconnaissance on what XPS Black was going to do as it was moving throughout the infrastructure looking for its end target, Armis picked up all sorts of unique devices in and out, in and around the port. The make, the model, the manufacturer, the software, the applications, the firmware that's on those devices, the vulnerability on those devices, and adding that context to what these devices are is incredibly important because we then want to enrich that information with data about those devices that we don't know anything about, but our customers certainly know something about them. And what I'm talking about here is integrating with platforms that already exist within the infrastructure. So, as you're all commonly aware, CMDVs, very popular, endpoint protection, very popular, Nessus scanners, Rapid7 scanners, all of those existing IT-centric platforms know an absolute ton of information about these devices that only goes to add value to the whole discovery process of what these devices are because it adds context to it. A PLC, an engineering workstation, connecting to a PLC in the same segment, not too interesting. A Dell machine connecting to that same PLC outside of that segment, yeah, maybe a little bit more interesting. A Dell machine outside of that segment connecting port 502 to that PLC that is accepting SMBv1 from the internet while they're on Facebook, really interesting, right? So that is the contextual difference. When you bring all of these types of information together that the organizations that we work with already know about these devices, does it have endpoint protection on it? Right? What is its lateral movement? What is north-south movement? What are the connections that it's making into those PLCs? Is it sending command and control to those PLCs? Contextually, we can make better decisions the more we know about what these devices are and who they're communicating to. We then obviously need to map the communications. And this kind of really, starts to look a little bit like zero trust. So if we understand the framework of zero trust, we understand that we need to identify our protect surface. Our protect surface may be a segment. Our protect surface may be a process. Our protect surface may be an entire boundary, right? But identifying that protect surface, step one, and step two. Step three is mapping the communications of what the devices or the components within that system are creating, right? This is understanding, well, that SCADA server, that engineering workstation, sending those SIP commands down to that PLC, its connections are now extending beyond the OT network. It's extending beyond the IT network. There's risk there. So it's mapping those connections and communications so that we can then make good decisions. We can then double back to the network guys and understand why these devices are accepting connections from outside of that boundary or even potentially outside of the enterprise. Detecting vulnerabilities, risks, and threats, right? So this is now where we need to understand, based upon what we understand the genetics of a device is, the genetics being its make, its model, its manufacturer, its hardware, its software, all the vulnerabilities on it, the actions that it's engaging in, the activities, the connections that it's creating. This is about understanding the risk posture of all the various components within the broader system, and then assigning a risk posture to that broader system. And then, as we come full circle, this then starts to, double back to the conversation I was having with the folks at Missy Dreamport that put on the simulation of Hack the Port back in Tampa in 2021, where I wanted to lean in and say, yeah, but we can insert in this kill chain all the way back to the DAuth attempt into the wireless LAN controller. Let me just orchestrate the denial of that connection. Let me orchestrate quarantining the device once it launched Nmap. Let me orchestrate cutting that TCP connection as that XPS Black tried to communicate across that firewall when it was engaging in port scans. Let me engage in that orchestration and cut that TCP connection to keep that device off of that PLC. Once that device connected to the PLC and started sending those write commands to drop that container, let me engage into that kill chain. Obviously, we were told not to, which was fine, but that's what this orchestration of security automation is talking about. It's talking about leveraging the existing infrastructure that's already there and to take advantage of it because it's already there. So what this is also talking about is taking advantage of the individuals that are already there that understand these platforms, right? It's one thing to suggest, hey, we can do security automation and we can leverage the existing infrastructure to remediate any bad behaviors or just to keep folks off the network to begin with. It's another thing to suggest, and you know what? We can use the existing infrastructure that you already have deployed, that you already have human assets running. So that brings us full circle to Armis. Armis is 6 years old. We just celebrated our 6th anniversary not too long ago. We have an incredible base of business. 40 of the Fortune 100 customers leverage Armis within their OT, IT, and IoT networks. They all leverage us for one common use case, which is then the platform for all the other use cases they want to solve for. They all leverage us, whether it's port infrastructure, whether it's utilities, whether it's critical manufacturing, pipelines, midstreams, upstreams, downstreams. They all are looking for the same thing. And this same thing is really the springboard to get to a zero trust, right? To get to CIS controls, to get to 62443, right? To get to the various frameworks that they're looking to get to. And that springboard is discovery. It's the discovery of every single asset on the network, regardless of if it's wired, regardless of if it's wireless, if it's within OT, if it's within IT, if it's the building management devices that surround those facilities that deliver gas, water, and electric. It's the badge readers, the card swipes, the elevators, and the escalators. Everything is within scope because I will tell you, for the most part, more often than not, all of these devices are interconnected. And all of these devices that are exploding onto our networks, they're unagentable and we can't scan them. So that is the one use case that regardless of vertical, all of our customers need to solve for. And I suspect many of you in the audience are thinking the exact same thing, right? My CMDB maybe knows about 40% of my devices. That oftentimes we find is a high number, right? I can't scan my Qualys, my Rapid7. I'm scanning known IPs, or I'm giving it a range and I'm scanning in that range, but I don't know what I'm not scanning. I know I don't want to scan on the OT side of the house because I don't want to tip over a process that's critical to me, right? So it's all these hidden devices that are found within OT, IT, and IoT, and then building in that contextual information, that contextual understanding of what those devices are, because I will tell you, one of the really interesting things that our customers tell us is, if you give me too much noise, you're going to end up on the shelf. If I come in on Monday morning and there's 400 alerts, I'm just going to tune it out. I've got too much to do. I need to get down to the remediation of actionable threats that actually can impact my business, right? And that's where we bring in the contextual intelligence, where by integrating with scanning platforms, by integrating with CMDBs and SIEMs and SOARs, Active Directory and vCenter, CrowdStrike, Symantec, SentinelOne, by integrating with all of these existing platforms that already exist within the network, we can then bring that contextual information to understand if a SCADA server is trying to communicate, or an engineering workstation is trying to communicate to a PLC within a hardened segment, and there are no connections in and out of that segment, or they're tightly monitored, why signal an alert? If that same activity is being called by a Dell machine with no endpoint protection on it, that we don't scan, that's within a protected environment with high risk, it's a different context. It's delivering the context of what the device is and what its actions look like, so we can have actionable steps so we're not chasing noise. Armis does this continuously. We do this passively. We sit on span ports if we need to sit on span ports. We can do this virtually with OVAs. We can also do this with no OVAs and with no hardware devices on the network. In this particular port example, we placed a hardware-based appliance on a switch, and that switch, it's a pretty flat network, saw everything coming and going. There was a couple access layer switches that we pulled data from as well. But in an OT environment, you're typically going to want to see the activities, right? We're going to want to see the actions and communications and connections that these devices are making, so we typically default to a piece of hardware. Could be OVA, but there are certainly instances where we can pull all this information about device awareness, about vulnerabilities, all the contextual understanding simply by integrations into the cloud, right? So imagine being able to, with about 20 to 30 minutes spent per integration, a week's work, we can pull up 30, 40 integrations into some of our larger customers' existing environment and parse all of that data from their existing environments into a cloud-based infrastructure called Armis, and then provide that contextual understanding to them continuously in real time without ever having to deploy a device. Which leads to the final bullet here, which is a quick time to value. So, we have a lot of conversations, and a lot of customers have actually come to Armis after they've already tried on something else, right? They went to the tailor and they tried on a jacket, and they're like, well, it looked good on the shelf, but it's kind of short in the arms, right? So they come back to Armis, and they're like, yeah, I'm looking for something that's a bit more easy to deploy. I'm looking for something that I can integrate with my existing platform. I can't hire anybody. I'm having a hard time keeping the people that I've got. So I certainly don't want to start deploying new tools that can't leverage the people I've got and the tools I've already deployed. So what we're talking about here is the quick time to value. It's the ability to deploy and get to good in the amount of time that's reasonable with our customers. We refer to that as maximizing ROI because, and many of you may have experienced this as well within your own organizations. These discussions are occurring more at the board level, and they're coming down, right? The CXO level, and these decisions are coming down. It's not often that we see these conversations begin and stay on the plant manager's level, on the floor, right? There are certainly wonderful use cases that need to be solved for, and we do solve for them on the plant floor. So the activities against all the industrial control system devices do that all day. But what we are seeing is these decisions are now coming top down, right? They're coming from the board, the CXOs, the VP levels are coming together, and we're starting to see a convergence between OT and IT, right? We're starting to see some of those barriers break down. We're starting to see some of those walls come down. And when those walls come down, what you then have are platform-wide solutions that leverage existing infrastructure and, more importantly, leverage existing folks that run that infrastructure. So that's what I've got. I hope you enjoyed our simulation into Missy's Hack the Port. We learned a ton from that engagement. Interestingly enough, since that engagement, Armis has probably acquired the security management of a half a dozen ports since October. So certainly I'll be sticking around if there are any questions that anybody has with regards to the Hack the Port event that we're invited to audit, or anything about Armis. So thank you very much.